set
All right.
and broadcast.
Well, hello everyone, and some people are still trickling in, and hello everyone that's watching this on Facebook. Tonight, in tonight's town hall discussion, we're going to be discussing broadband here in New Hampshire, and obviously our connectivity changes. Hey, Johnny. Our connectivity needs have changed a lot due to COVID-19, and that impacts funding in the future. And we are incredibly lucky and honored to be joined by Dr. Scott Falcourt, the Director of Strategic Technology and a co-director of the Telehealth Practice Center at the University of New Hampshire. He is also the Principal Investigator for the New Hampshire Broadband Technology Opportunities Program. And as always, we will get to all questions and answers. Just throw them in the Q&A box. And without further ado, I turn over the floor to these two.
Okay, and I'm going to actually start by sharing my screen. Hey, good evening, everyone. I think you all know me by now. It's Sue Prentiss, and I'm so fortunate to have Scott with us tonight, so we can have this discussion about, about broadband and about the status in New Hampshire. There's never been we've been talking about this for a long time, but there's never been a more important time to have this discussion because there's a crack in our technological infrastructure here in New Hampshire, and it's not so much that it's widened, it's just how the light is shining through it during COVID-19. But first, let's just talk about why broadband's important. Broadband is, I consider it like a highway, like a road in my community or roads throughout our community. It is how we travel. But in this case, it's how information travels. It's how we get to where we're going. So it's important to New Hampshire because there's information that needs to make it to all corners of our state. And it's not just having it available, it is the speed. And this is what, Scott will really, he will be able to technologically dig into this for us. It's the speed by which it makes this trip that becomes really important now more than ever. So the conversation we know has changed here in New Hampshire. We've been talking about broadband and broadband expansion, high-speed internet access for a number of years and been making progress. But what COVID-19 did is it showed us that, we have students that are learning from home and teachers that are teaching from home. We have part of our workforce and large parts of our workforce that could go remote, went remote, and were required or had a role to work from home. Telehealth, we saw access to healthcare in rural areas in particular, but we also saw this in urban settings. Not everybody needed to go in to see their healthcare provider, but they still needed to see them, and they were able to accomplish this through telehealth. One of the areas, and we talked about this, we touched on it a little last week in a different conversation, but we're gonna talk about it more tonight, is the access to mental health services. We've seen an uptick in people who've taken advantage of being able to see a provider because they can see them from that one comfort zone or one of the comfort zones that they have. This is also a place where we connect with people because there are folks that are high risk. I have a mom who's 88 years old, and I feel terrible that she, she's literally like stuck in her house. This is down in Massachusetts. She has reasonable enough broadband, and we've taught her how to, well, not really Zoom, but we've taught her how to, FaceTime and use other ways to connect with us because that's how she's seeing her family right now. This, and for a number of us, is how we're seeing our family, how we're seeing our friends, how even some, social activities are taking place. And also folks might be, attending their house of worship through a platform that is supported by broadband. Primary point here is that this is a completely different ballgame now, and it is really, it's a silver lining for us. We have been talking about this, we've been working on this, and now we're seeing all the different places that we have, exposures where that light is really shining on it, that we can take advantage of an opportunity here, funding and partnerships that are coming our way to basically finish the job that's been started. And briefly, is before we turn the floor over and get into some of the really interesting tech talk about this, I think it's important to note that the CARES Act has brought, it's about $50 million to the state of New Hampshire, and it's to support this expansion and primarily looking at identifying, underserved areas, places that we really need to get to first to get this job done. There shouldn't be a time where a student has to drive to a parking lot of a Panera Bread or a local supermarket or someplace else to finish their homework. This should not become a barrier to folks because it's safer for them to work from home. And we need to be able to provide them with this access. And again, this has now become, an access to healthcare issue. So for all of these reasons and the social connections that I talked about, the CARES Act brings to us some funding to really target some of those underserved areas first in getting this job, making the final, we want to call it not the last mile, Scott, but the super final mile. So that is, so without further ado, I want to take this conversation and turn it over to Scott. I would say one of my newest friends, because this is his area of expertise, and it's so I'm going to just say no more and turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Sue. You're talking about as we sort of entered into this period of time where we were all asked to work from home and stay home and do all those sorts of things. For me, that was on St. Patrick's Day on March 17. Was the last day I spent time in my office in Durham, and I haven't really been back since. And here we are in August, and so this is where I work. This is kind of where I live. But my commute is significantly shorter than it would have been before. And that's only made possible because broadband is available at my house and is also available at the university. So I'm able to do what I need to do between the two locations, but that isn't the case everywhere in New Hampshire. And so what I like when I talk about broadband and we're going to have a conversation. So I want to make sure that and it's the faculty member in me. I like to start with some terminology, make sure we're all coming from the same perspective and be sure that we know when we use the terms, we're using them the same way. And so the first question I pose out here on this slide is what is broadband? And so simply the term broadband is a collection of the frequencies that are being used. It's typically a radio term. And those frequencies are used in which each frequency is a carrier of some kind of signal. That signal, we're probably used to it. And you see in the center of the slide there, I have sort of a layout of what the frequencies might look like on a wire, like the pair of wires that you would have connected to your house that your phone is connected to. And that's what POTS stands for plain old telephone service. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as POTS. And plain old telephone service that we've had for 100+ years that goes everywhere in the whole country, that uses a set of frequency that is underneath the very lowest level of frequencies that run on copper wires. And we've been using that for years. But as digital technology became available to us, as new technologies were being invented, they initially were available in Europe a whole lot sooner than they were here in the United States on twisted pairs, the kind of wires that go into your house that your phone line is on. What we started to see originally rolled out, which was in the Midwest as the first, Midwest and the South around Atlanta were the first places that were testing out this new technology. And that was a technology called ADSL, Asymmetric Digital Subscriber Line. And DSL, as we commonly refer to it, you hear about it, Digital Subscriber Line, just refers to all the many different flavors that have come out. And there's been about a half a dozen or so. And then they've all had upgrades, so they all have number 2s at the end of them. And then they all sometimes have little pluses after them, which means they've had even further upgrades. So we're probably talking like now a dozen to 15 or so different flavors of DSL that are out there, but they all predominantly have the same kind of purpose in that they use multiple frequencies that are above that telephone service in order to deliver communication. And each one of those frequency bands can send some data, and it is typically sent in parallel, so that if you're using DSL at home and you want to see a picture on a website, that picture is being sent in little packets over each multiple frequencies at the same time. So when you receive it, it's all put back together again, it looks like the picture you're looking for. And that has been the way in the US we initially started off delivering broadband technology. But as over time, we've seen other technologies come forward. But the thing to remember when it comes to what is broadband, other than the fact there's the technical piece behind it, broadband is also, it's also a marketing term in some respects, because the definition of what is broadband, besides being these multiple frequencies that carry bits to and from various places, is the rates in which broadband is defined. And the Federal Communications Commission, the nationwide organization that determines what our communications systems will be, what frequencies will be made available out there. You know, if you're going to listen to the radio in your car, the FCC has allocated those frequency bands for the radio that you are receiving in your car, which are different from, say, the radio signals that might be on your handheld telephone that are communicating to the base station and your handheld device, as well as the frequencies to your cell phone, which would be different, as well as frequencies to maybe your remote controlled television remote that you have. All different frequencies, but the FCC coordinates all of them. And so the FCC has defined broadband nationwide. To be broadband, it has to have a minimum of a 25 megabits per second downstream and a 3 megabits per second upstream. And those are numbers that sort of define the speeds at which broadband goes. And those rates make an event like this that allow us to have a video conference where, yes, there's signal coming down to the computer from the outside to my house, but also I and my computer and my camera and my microphone are broadcasting up signal. And so that 3 megabits per second is very important, because if it were less than that, I might not be coming across as clear. I might have dropped packets. I might have skipped audio. My video might freeze. I might look like I'm sleeping because my video is one picture as opposed to many images being sent. And so, so broadband is important to have this rate be defined, because anything less than that isn't really broadband. And it makes doing the kinds of things that we expect to do in this environment a lot harder. So let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the other definitions that go in there. You may also hear the terms middle mile and last mile when it comes to broadband delivery. And so broadband, both of them are very important. It's one thing to have, you know, something that connects to your house like a phone line that could run DSL on it that's at your house. It's another thing to know that the large pipes that aggregate all of the communications connections from your neighborhood are all going to a larger pipe that can then go up to, say, the internet or to other sources that might be out there in the world. It's no different than probably the water system that you have in your community. You probably have large water mains that are running through the center of your town, which then break up into smaller mains as they get into neighborhoods, which then has a certain service tap that goes directly into your house, probably has that little knob that's in the front of your house that can be turned on and off by the water company. And then inside your house, there are pipes that run inside, there's spigots on the outside, there's probably a shutoff on the inside of your house. And those are the ways in which you can make sure the water flows or doesn't flow inside your house. Broadband works very similarly in the way that it flows. In that middle mile are these very large pipes. Almost always middle mile is delivered through fiber optic cables, because fiber optic cables can carry the greatest amount of bandwidth. And they are coming from the internet, which is the little cloud I have on the picture, through large metropolitan areas to central offices, which typically are where many of these points of presence might be that serve a community from some service aggregation point. And then ultimately they connect to the last mile, which is some connection, typically a box on a pole that connects to a box on the side of a house, which is the images that I have on here, that is the mechanism that delivers broadband to your house. So it's important to have both middle mile available and last mile available. And that works in both the wired technology like DSL or cable, but it also works also in the kind of technology you might use relative to your cell phone and cellular technology. That tower that is sending and receiving cell signal has to have middle mile that delivers some connectivity to that tower in order to have those wireless communications channels work on the outside. Because otherwise, it'd be great to have communications back and forth from the tower, but nothing would go away from the tower without a large pipe to be able to aggregate all of that data to and from sources that are away from that wireless tower. So middle mile is very important, not just for delivering wired technology, but also for wireless technology. And let's go to the next slide. And so there are a number of different kinds of technologies that we are using here in the United States. I list on here dial-up technology because it wasn't that long ago. The dial-up modem that had that screeching sound that, you know, allowed you to connect to like America Online or AOL that would say, "You've got mail," like that wonderful Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan movie. That was dial-up modems, and that ran at 56,000 bits per second or 56 kbps. And as we get larger, we go from Ks, which are 1,000, next 1,000 up is mega, next 1,000 up is giga, then tera, then peta, and then I think we go to exa, and there's even larger numbers that go after that. But in each of these technologies, DSL, VDSL, cable, these are all wired-based technology. I put 4G LTE cellular as it's on here as a wireless technology. There are other wireless technologies that are operating here in New Hampshire from a number of New Hampshire companies. And then finally, I guess the one that has the greatest capability for delivering broadband and probably has the longest lasting capability, that once it gets put on the poles, it's probably got a lifespan between 20 to 40 years and is probably only subject to weather and sun making the plastic covering break down on the fiber cables on the poles, is the fiber optic cable. Dense wave division multiplexing, coarse wave division multiplexing, a couple of different types of technologies that we are seeing right now when it comes to delivering broadband. And each one of those little fiber strands of glass, and they really are glass, it's a piece of glass that has been manufactured to be very, very precisely organized such that when light passes inside this glass, it reflects on the inside of the glass continuously without or with very minimal degradation over kilometers and kilometers of distance, such that the signal that goes in is the same signal coming out on the other side. And with that, we can get speeds, well, we can get speeds as fast as light. You know, the c² part of Einstein's theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. I mean, the c² part, the c is 186,000 feet per second. That is the speed of light. And so that's as fast as we can go on fiber. And that's really darn fast. And we're not there yet. But light helps us get that signal back and forth. And I put moving 5 petabytes per month on here just to say that at the University System of New Hampshire, we have a network that connects all of the university system campuses right now. And we are moving 5 petabytes of data a month. And that just keeps climbing and climbing as we rely much more heavily on broadband in order to do what we do. And so next slide is the last one that I have here to talk about. And so when we think about broadband and where we're going, obviously the best solution is to invest in fiber, because fiber has that long-lasting capability, and it has the ability to deliver much, much more broadband than we could ever use. And the only need to increase that broadband, should we ever need to do it, is to change the ends on each end of the fiber. The fiber itself, once it's installed, it's the same fiber that could be used for 40 years. We just change the ends and the hardware on each end in order to make the signal a lot better. But even cable and DSL has a place to get us started, provided, of course, the delivery mechanism is at that 25.3, as is defined by the FCC to be broadband right now. And I probably don't need to say to many of you, but one of the things that the folks in, I think this was in Indiana, is where I got this initial reference, is that for every $1 invested in rural broadband, the folks from Indiana did some research. The economists there estimated that about $4 in net present value is achieved in areas where they make that kind of rural broadband investment. And that all comes from telemedicine, economic and workforce development, education, enhanced farm business. This is Indiana after all, with greater access to their cooperative extension services and other resources. And that is all prior to COVID-19. So add COVID-19 and the things that we've had to do vastly differently that take full advantage of the need for broadband. And now we have a totally different world and a huge opportunity to make sure our investment in broadband gets us to where we want to be. And so investing in fiber is the way to go. And if you click one more spot on that slide, I think there's an additional set of text that I added underneath that, invest in fiber. Yeah, the 30-year life. It's unlimited capacity, nearly unlimited capacity, and the reliability is huge for us to be able to make fiber be a solution that gets us out there. So that's the kind of thing that, if you've been paying attention in New Hampshire, that our friends in Chesterfield, in partnership with Consolidated Communications Incorporated, are building out fiber to every single home in Chesterfield as a result of some of the legislative changes that have been made in the last couple of years in New Hampshire to make that possible. And that has been a very interesting project that all of us have been watching, and all of us have been very happy to see how that has been moving. And there are many other communities that are looking to follow suit. And so the way that moves on is, what can we do in order to make broadband be ubiquitous, be everywhere in the state, to serve every single location, so that it doesn't matter where you live, you can get clean water, you can get electricity, you can have access to telephone service for Lifeline, 911 services, but also how can you also get broadband delivered, because frankly, broadband has now become the next thing that is going to be necessary for us in order to live the kinds of world life things that we do every single day around telemedicine, around our work life, our economic development and opportunity, our education, and just the day-to-day communication right now with our friends and neighbors.
So I
Go ahead, Sue.
Thanks so much, Scott. So I have some questions, and then I want to certainly open it up to the group. But before I start with some of my questions, to kind of flesh out our discussion, is I just want to make clear, and I didn't in the very beginning, but you really, as you talked about this, especially at the end here, this becomes an issue of equality. Basically, making, bringing equality across the state. It's somewhat, it's an issue of, of justice in a way, where there isn't this access available. Again, we have students, teachers, people who maybe can't work because their workplace has been shifted and they are now required to do this from home, access to healthcare. So there's a significant equality issue that we've seen really kind of sort of mushroom out of this whole conversation when it came to COVID-19. And, in your last sentence there, we're about, how we're in a phased survival, but we have to move ourselves as a government and as a state into the next phase of this, which is about thriving. And
I have a colleague of mine who likes to be very clear about referring to broadband as being a another one of the basic human rights that we as human beings should have around the world. He very much spends a lot of time in other parts of the world, and I've got colleagues who are doing some very interesting broadband delivery mechanisms in Africa and in Asia as well. And the whole concept of broadband, if you look at the way it's being deployed in some of these areas where they don't have electricity, they don't have telephone service that's delivered, but what they are investing in is broadband and cellular service, because that's just a matter of bringing a piece of fiber and putting a tower in place and then serving a wide span of land area with this kind of communication. And that has become the next way in which people in those other parts of the world are able to communicate with each other, get the things they need to participate in the economy of their area, and also to get the help that's necessary when it comes to things like telemedicine and other sorts of services. So yes, more and more I am in agreement with him that the notion of broadband is becoming this basic human right that we need to look at. How do we make sure broadband is everywhere? Not that everybody we know is likely going to take it and use it, but that the option to be able to have it is one of those pieces. And that is not the case in New Hampshire. There are places where you just cannot get broadband. No one will go serve those areas. And that's where we still have a lot of work to do. It isn't a big percentage in New Hampshire. There are other states that are far worse off than we are. But those places in New Hampshire, and we know them, we know our friends and neighbors, they talk to us regularly, they tell us stories, no matter where we are in the grocery store, out on the trail hiking, all kinds of places. They'll tell the story of, I can't get it at my house, I have to go downtown, I have to go to the library in order to connect to do my work. And that's the only way they can get it, because there's just no one will deliver it out to where they are without some either some exorbitant amount of money to do that sort of thing, because it's just not economically feasible, or it's very significantly difficult to do that from a physical standpoint, because there are either no poles, or it's rugged territory, they're on the backside of a mountain, whatever it might be. The challenges are just too great.
So thank you, total agreement. So thinking about moving forward, I want to talk about poles and how we push this technology out, above ground versus underground. But you had mentioned at one point the speed of light, being the fastest. And then we just heard from you, I think these are on two different scales, or that we know where we don't have this kind of really, super fast access, or even access in general. So I guess two questions. One, where do we have this, broadband, high speed internet, the speed of light access? Where does that exist in New Hampshire?
Well, there are lots of places where fiber is already on the poles out there in the state. There are some 70-something service providers that are offering, that the FCC has are serving out there in the state of New Hampshire, and that number may be different even now. It may have gone even up, I think, with some of the changes that have happened over the last few years. And where that fiber is at the moment is obviously all owned by those providers. So they know where it is. It is not necessarily something that's delivered out there to say this is where the fiber happens to be, because you and I, we can't just take a ladder and go up and tap something into a pole and say, okay, now I'm getting service off a line. That would be, I suspect that's probably illegal, though I'm not certain about that. But B, it would certainly be highly unsafe, and we don't want anybody going up on poles who are not appropriately licensed to do so and have the skills necessary to make that sort of thing happen. However, we know there's fiber in New Hampshire because it's serving a lot of people today. There are locations like Chesterfield where it's being installed today, fiber to the home. There are locations in Ringe and Enfield that were part of the BTOP project about 10 years ago that have fiber to the home in certain places. And we know that Verizon, which was a couple of companies ago that used to own all of the copper cable plant in the state of New Hampshire, they initially were dabbling with the Fios product in southern New Hampshire. And so there are locations in southern New Hampshire that today have Fios. And we know that many of the cable providers use fiber as a way of being able to get to the territory that they're in, and then they serve the territory with copper. And in some cases, are also offering fiber optic connections to various businesses with business lines and those sorts of things. So fiber is available in very specific areas across the state, but it's not ubiquitous. It's not everywhere. And in some cases, it might make sense. In other cases, it might not. It really depends on what is the need to deliver broadband, because we can get broadband service 25x3 on some copper lines. My house has a coax copper cable, and I'm getting 100 megabits per second downstream, and I think 11 or 12 megabits per second upstream, which is way above the FCC definition of broadband. But that's on a copper cable. And that right now for me is serving quite well. But I know that there are lots of places where they can't even get that. And so that means we've still got work to do.
And that's part of where we're going to go now in this conversation is how, how we're going to move forward. I wanted to touch on two things quickly as we start this part of the conversation. Well, actually, I'm going to lean back into when you talked about Chesterfield. There was a piece of legislation passed, Senate Bill 170. It was not this session. I believe it was the session before. And what it allowed was for municipalities to bond, to work with a provider and to bond so that they could build out this, which is essentially infrastructure. So that was, and a lot of people, you're right, they've been watching that to see how it's worked. But there is another piece of legislation we'll talk about that was just signed off. It was signed by the governor that will actually take this the next step further and really promoting some of the like the partnerships and cooperative regional ways that we're known to do business here in New Hampshire. So, well, here in New Hampshire, we do in other parts of the country, but most important to me is how we do it here in New Hampshire, and certainly in this, in the Connecticut River Valley. So thinking about how we move forward from here, I have this opinion that broadband should be treated, it should be like part of the 10-year highway plan, because it's how you get where you're going. And it has become, it is an infrastructure asset that it's a road. In some cases, it's a bridge. I don't know how that will look, but I'm thinking, and I wanted to hear from you about not just a task force, but you had mentioned to me, like the state of Maryland has an agency, and this is what they do because it's such a high priority for them. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then we need to talk about like what the costs could look like, and how this, how we can get this, maybe not at the speed of light, but as close as possible out to everywhere in New Hampshire. So I'll start there.
Sure. Yeah. So there was a broadband study committee in the legislature, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. And their purpose was to look at what was going on in broadband in various states, as well as what could be the approach that's done in New Hampshire. And I was specifically asked to come and testify and provide some input around what other states are doing, what's Maine doing, what's Vermont doing, what's Massachusetts doing, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Delaware, those sorts of places, places that are similar to New Hampshire, and talk about how do they make things happen? How do they make broadband be an area of focus? And certainly the view of broadband, much the same way as we do roads and bridges infrastructure, fiber optic infrastructure. In fact, we have a term for it in the research community. We call it cyber infrastructure, or CI. And cyber infrastructure is just as critical when you're talking about research and in research areas as, you know, laboratories where there's beakers and Bunsen burners and hoods and all those sorts of things, when it comes to figuring out what's the next thing that we need to put in place and what's the next thing that's going to happen in order to come up with a new discovery. And so if we look at broadband as an infrastructure, we should be having a plan for how we're going to build out, maintain, grow that infrastructure, much the same way we do with our roads and bridges. And when the governor took office, shortly after that, and budget building time was taking place, there was an activity going on in the school area that is funded through an organization that's an offshoot of the FCC called the Universal Services Administrative Company, or USAC. They administer the E-rate funds. Everybody, all of us, all of our telecommunications bills have this little, you know, it's probably a few pennies per month on our bill that goes to the Universal Services Fund. And that Universal Services Fund all gets pooled in Washington, and USAC then issues it out as E-rate money to schools and libraries in order to give them a discount in their cost for their network access, for their internet connectivity. And a couple of years back, when the governor took office, there was an extra set of money made available in what was called Category 1 funding that allowed schools to build fiber optic cable to the school building instead of a copper cable, so that they were future-proofed, that school would then be able to expand with new broadband without ever having to change the connectivity that goes into the building. But that required a 10% match from a legislative controlled funding source. And so we worked with the governor's office as part of our New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative that I helped to found. And we got the governor's office to, in the infrastructure budget, carve a little piece of money, about $4 million set aside of the $85 million, I think, for infrastructure, to declare fiber optic connectivity as infrastructure. And that fund became the matching fund for any school districts that wanted to go and upgrade. And I think we had about 9 districts in New Hampshire that one and only year we could do it, be able to tap into some of that money and build out and get more fiber into their schools, which then meant that there were more school students in the state of New Hampshire that now were being able to use fiber optic based broadband in school as opposed to copper based, which then gave them access to things like videos and other online learning resources, which of course today is now, you know, highly beneficial foresight to do that. But of course, we're no longer in the school buildings, we're now in people's houses, which is not where that fiber is located. So that build out of fiber and the funding that goes along with that was the first step towards moving us into the next realm of how do we get partnerships to come together to help us build out fiber optic broadband in various places. And so the SB 170 that was passed in the previous legislative session that allowed municipalities to bond for broadband means that a municipality can say, this is a location that doesn't have, it's not being served with the FCC's definition of broadband. We want to create we want to go to bond in order to get the funding necessary to connect that location. And then there are some stipulations that go along with that, such as the only way that construction can happen is it must be done in partnership with one of those 70-something providers in the state of New Hampshire that are licensed to put connectivity up on poles and deliver cabling to the homes and businesses that are identified in that project. So it becomes this need to discuss, develop, and build out a project in a partnership form that is typically between both a private entity or several private entities and some public body. It might be the town council, it might be a broadband committee that the town forms, it might be a group of concerned citizens in a neighborhood area or a homeowners association that say, we want to bring it to our area, this is what we want to do, and can we take advantage of that? And as you mentioned, there's been the add-on that the governor recently signed, HB 1111 in this legislative session, that actually takes that a step further and allows multiple communities to come together to form a communications district that bridges over multiple municipalities, and that communications district can then go and follow all the same procedures that are in SB 170, which is they can go and create bonding for the funding necessary for a project, but it requires a public-private partnership. And with a larger volume, the expectation is that they can attract more potential private partners who want to build out in that area, which makes it more economically available for those private companies to go and connect up communities. Because connecting one household, when somebody says, hey, I need broadband, I'm over here and I can't get it, one company who serves that area and one customer, economically, that's really hard to justify from a business perspective. But when an entire community becomes available, and that once that whole community gets connected, and this one provider or multiple providers that come together to do that work can build it all out and then serve for multiple years in whatever that arrangement might be in a public-private partnership, that becomes economically viable. And that is where the wins happen across the board for everybody. So there's great opportunity in bringing people together, but it all starts with people coming together and saying, we have a need, let's form together and identify what that need is, and then bring to the table the private entities that might help build that out and be successful. And there are some resources in the state that we're working to try to put in place, both in conjunction with our New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative, which of course, schools, libraries, communities, why not? It's all the same process to bring people together from a public-private partner perspective. But also, are there other resources like funding agencies and other funding sources that might come to bear, like your local community bank organization? Did you want to talk about a little bit about what that opportunity might be, Sue?
Well, the CRA banking funds.
Yeah. That's a relatively new thing that has come onto the scene here. Do you want me to take that, or you want?
I think one of the important pieces in thinking about this, because we're at such an important nexus where we've got CARES Act money, and then the CRA banking funds become available because they, their history is targeting low and moderate income communities to do these types of projects.
Right.
So this has become is right now, is in front of us as a way to support this broadband.
Yeah, CARES Act money. I mean, the governor's office, through the Office of Strategic Initiatives, has identified $50 million for broadband expansion, and there's some very, very specific rules around that. So it's not just hey, you got a project, come on down. It is very specific. It can't be projects that are already underway. It can't be projects that that are going into areas that are already considered served in the state based on what data that is already available. And as I understand it, there are some projects that have been reviewed, and soon we'll be hearing about them. I don't know what they are, so I'm not going to be able to get myself into trouble by saying any names or whatever. But those projects, we're going to all hear about them pretty soon, and those are going to be projects that are taking advantage of that funding in order to deliver broadband. And it has to be done before December 31st of 2020. So it's really short, really quick type projects. So that's the CARES Act money that's come forward. That's short term. How do we get something out there as quickly as we possibly can to do the fastest good? And there are federal agencies that have done exactly the same thing across the board in all areas of the federal government from the CARES Act that was passed. But then the CRA funds, or the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, I think, is when that was passed. I mean, that's been around a long time, and that basically says that banks that are located in communities must, by law, invest 10% of the profits that they're making in that community into projects inside that community. And there's a very specific list of qualifying projects that the bank examiners will go through in order to verify that all community banks are meeting in order to satisfy their CRA requirements. Those have typically been things like affordable housing, schools, safe playgrounds for various areas, community centers, things that help the people in the community, that sort of stuff, more physical, tangible construction type projects. And then there was a wave of changes that came in that said, well, maybe as a way to both help the banking industry as well as people who live in low and moderate income locations in the United States, based on the Census Bureau statistics, they should be able to have access to banking education. So how do you open up a checking account? How do you use a checking account? What's credit? How do you get credit? How do you work with credit? Why is credit important? And so that kind of education, and bankers who go out and do those kinds of programs for communities, those counted as CRA qualifying activities to check off the box and satisfy the 10% reinvestment. But just in the last year or two, we've started to get those rules modified to also include the ability to bring broadband to low and moderate income locations, because without broadband, people in low and moderate income areas can't get living wages. You can't apply for a federal job without broadband. There is no paper form to fill out for a federal job anymore. We just don't do that. You can't file your taxes without having broadband access. You can't get tax forms on paper anymore. You can't go to the library. The library doesn't have them. They don't ship them anymore. So they're only available electronically, and the only way to get them would be to have an access to some sort of broadband. And so that CRA funds, banks are now looking and saying, oh, if I can help fund a build out of broadband into a low and moderate income area, that will allow my bank to get some qualifying investment towards our CRA 10% profit investment in our community. And that's good for the bank, that's good for the community, that's good for everybody. And so that's a new source of funding that we're going to start to see. And I believe Franklin Savings Bank is working right now in the community in Franklin to work on a project to sort of be the first example project that's CRA funding. And there are a number that are lined up right behind it. And the National Collaborative for Digital Equity, based in Ware, New Hampshire, is actually spearheading a lot of that activity nationally, but trying to make sure that New Hampshire has the first example projects to hold up to the rest of the country and say, do like New Hampshire, we got it right.
We like to be first.
Yes, we do. First in the nation in many ways.
I know we have some questions and I want to get to them, but
let's do that.
Say a few things first, just to kind of cap parts of these conversations. So you had mentioned, we talked about, it was House Bill 111, but really it was Senate Bill 457 was put onto that, creating these governing districts. And I just think it's important to point out that this is in the style or the philosophy of New Hampshire, where especially in some of the more rural areas where you can get groups of communities to come together to share an asset. We've seen this in wastewater, in water systems. We've also seen this in emergency medical services, and in sharing some type of sharing an entity. So this is very much in that spirit, which I applaud that kind of work. I think that's essential. And I also
the 9 regional planning commissions across the state have been, for decades, and even more so now, very involved in broadband, keeping the broadband conversation going, looking at communities and helping communities build out broadband when necessary. So a great source for partnerships is to turn to the RPCs. In just about every single county, they are out there and they are ready to help. They've got people who are focused in this area.
Great. And as I pull up the questions, I just want to mention there's an interesting partnership that's taking place in the General Plymouth area, which is the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, is, that's it's a utility. They have they're getting into the game and becoming part of this conversation and seeing how they can partner to bring broadband into areas that they serve. Just another way to, as we say, get the job done. So
yeah, electric co-ops across the country, when you look at what they've been doing, they've been saying, oh, we already have lines going this way. Maybe we ought to do something that involves broadband expansion too. And so the New Hampshire Electric Co-op has been seeing a similar type thing. And, if you've been following their decision making, they first decided they would not include broadband as part of electric co-op's process. And then eventually said, we're going to create this thing on the side that works in parallel as a separate entity. And I totally understand that, because it doesn't dilute the focus of what they do so well for those communities, which is deliver great electric service. They don't want to dilute that, but at the same token, the opportunity to capitalize on the assets they already have and expand with broadband in some of those same communities, that's a parallel function that they're only ripe to do that. And they're looking, I'm sure, at the other country locations in other parts of the country, other states, and saying, yeah, we can do that too. And that's great. I'm glad that they're looking at that.
Trying to move these questions so I can see your face while I'm asking them.
You don't have to do that. My face will always be here still.
We have two questions from my friend Rob Welch up on the hill here in Lebanon, who wants to know what part of New Hampshire does not currently have broadband.
Yeah, so right now, the current source to look to see who may have broadband and who might not have broadband is to go to the FCC's website that's called the National Broadband Map. And if you have broadband or you have access to a Google browser, you can click and type into your Google search engine or whatever your favorite search engine is, and look up National Broadband Map, FCC, and it will take you to that point, and it'll bring up a visual map that you can drill right down into New Hampshire, and you can go to your community and look and see what are the providers who report to the FCC, because all the providers in the country who are serving broadband have a responsibility to report on a semi-annual basis to the FCC what their status is and who they're serving. The challenge with the maps is the maps, by definition, are only as granular as a US Census block. And a US Census block, if you're not familiar with that terminology, it's census time right now, is that a census block has the same amount of people defined in it, and the entire country is broken up into blocks that are exactly the same size, so that if you use census data, you can compare one census block in one part of the country to another census block in another part of the country. But as you can imagine, a census block in New York City is a New York City block. A census block in New Hampshire, or probably maybe a better example, is a census block in maybe like Wyoming, might be several hundred square miles, because that's the same number of people that reside in a census block in Wyoming as do in a city block in Manhattan. And so you're not going to find your street and see exactly what your street has available. You're going to see your street inside a census block, and the reporting will be by census block. So you can kind of see what might be there, might not be there. And because the reporting is by census block, if one house is served in the block, the whole block is served. And we know that that's not true because the granularity isn't there. And we're trying to correct that. And at the federal level, there's a new mapping program that's just now starting up through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the Department of Commerce, called the National Broadband Availability Map. And that is hopefully will have the granularity at the street level, but that is just now starting. And we're probably still a few years out before we see anything come out of that.
Okay, perfect. So again, Rob Welch, you want to know if we have Comcast coming into our homes. Is this broadband as you are defining it?
It depends. You can use the speed test program. I think pretty much every provider these days is contracted with Ookla, Ookla. They've had a speed test that they've offered out there on the internet for people to be able to test their broadband connection. You run it in your local web browser, and it sends packets to a cloud-based server located in some nearby city, and it will measure the speed at which those packets go from your house back to the server. And you can run it either on your Comcast. So if you have Comcast, I think it might be speedtest.xfinity.net or xfinity.com. If you have Spectrum, I think it's, speedtest.spectrum.com or something like that. But if you just type in speed test in Google, you'll likely come up with one of the Ookla ones, and you can run the test, and you can see whether or not, based on the test, whether your downstream and upstream rates are what you believe you're paying for based on what your contract is with your service provider. If it isn't, there should be an opportunity for you to communicate with your provider and say, hey, how come I'm not getting that kind of service? The other thing that they will ask you about, and you should be aware of that, is that the proper way to do that speed test is for you to connect your computer via a wired network connection directly into your modem that would also be connected into the wired network connection. Because if you're running like a laptop over your Wi-Fi network or the Wi-Fi network provided by your modem, then you're testing the Wi-Fi network as well as the wired network. And those two are usually not the same and can introduce some slowdowns just in the Wi-Fi part of things. So that's something to be aware of when you do a speed test. But a speed test would certainly help you find out whether or not you have broadband. And if your rates are, at or above the 25 meg downstream, 3 meg upstream, then you have broadband. Otherwise, you would be considered underserved, as a terminology that you might hear out there. And as a result, your location should then be one that qualifies to be part of some opportunity to upgrade your network connection to get you to broadband speeds.
Great. All right. Thanks, Scott. So Suzalmi says, for a while, every time we upgraded our speed, the big cities elaborated the websites so that we with copper wires didn't have enough speed to be able to use the websites effectively. That seems to be easier now. If you have normal broadband, but once there is more fiber and 5G, will those of us not considered important for broadband be frozen out again?
Well, it's an interesting problem. The definition of broadband is it's a term that's defined by rulemaking, and not even legislation. It's by rulemaking. So the FCC has said, yep, broadband is 25 by 3. And the FCC tomorrow could come back and say, you know what? It now needs to be 100 by 10. That's the new definition for broadband. And it's a moving target, and it's precisely for the same reason why you mentioned that as you get an upgrade and all the websites get an upgrade. If you look at a website from, say, like 1999 or 2000, and you look at one now in 2020, they are night and day different. And in the past, you would have maybe some colored pictures and some text. And today, you might go to a website and it's immediately showing you a video in the background of something in front. And that is only going to be made possible and viewable if you have significant levels of broadband to make those kinds of websites be available to you. So as more and more applications take advantage of needing to have higher bandwidths, I'm sure there'll be a point in time when the FCC is going to look at the landscape and say, it's probably time for us to redefine broadband and step it up to another level. And then what will happen is at that rulemaking, everybody who has broadband at 25 by 3 will suddenly no longer have broadband if they have 25 by 3, and there'll need to be more upgrades that go on. That will mean there'll be more people who need to be part of some kind of upgrade program and be ready for that sort of stuff. And that's why we need to make sure that we're always looking at future infrastructure, how do we keep ensuring that the infrastructure is always being upgraded? Just like how do we make sure I-93 is getting fresh coats of pavement every few years so that the cracks and the holes don't cause the kinds of problems on the roads that lead to accidents and other types of problems. The same thing is with broadband. We got to keep upgrading and make sure that we can get everything that is available to us.
Great. So Johnny Christensen's, his question is, when attempting to improve broadband access across the state, how do we define success? Now, there's a few parts to this question, so I thought we'd start there. How do we define success?
That's a good one. How do we define success? Well, you know, I'd like to think that success is that at least everybody has some kind of access to broadband connectivity, and whether that's broadband as defined by the FCC or something that's slightly less than broadband, but at least is better than a dial-up modem, you know, the 56K type thing. That would be a good first step, and right now we don't even have that. So so that would probably be a good first success. Can we at least get there? And then the second thing would be, how do we make sure that as we're building out, we are always building out in a future-proofed way? That's the approach that we took in the New Hampshire School Connectivity Initiative. Was we only wanted to make sure schools built out broadband with fiber, because that was the only way they were going to be future-proofed. And so if we look towards future broadband projects, I'd like us to be successful and be building out fiber, because once we build the fiber out, we don't need to go out there on the poles anymore. All we need to do is change what's on the ends, something in somebody's house, something that is available at the provider's side of things. So, so that would be the next, to me, the success would be, could we get fiber everywhere? And that's going to be a tall order. It's going to take some time, but with focus and a plan, we could get there, because other states are doing exactly that.
And there's some other parts of this question, some of which you've touched on, but I want to make sure we get it all for Johnny. Are certain measures of success more or less important than others? For example, should we focus more on coverage, timely rollout, reliable connectivity, or affordability? What's most important? And I do hear you talking time and time again about fiber as being one of those, like, you know, I want to call it a benchmark or a mark that we have to say, yep, this is where we want to go. So,
my approach has always been twofold in terms of what's the way to go in that direction. The first one is future-proofing technology. Let's try to make sure that we're delivering technology that will be, that is one and done. Once we put the technology out there, we're great. The second piece is, it's also got to be affordable, because it's great to have the technology, but if people can't afford to get to it, then it's the same as if you don't have the access at all, because
quality.
It's still a gap to get there. Yeah. And so how do we get the economics to work correctly in order to take full advantage of that high capacity? And so maybe some of the steps are deliver fiber to a neighborhood and then deliver copper out to people's homes. Copper will be less costly, but at least the broadband backbone will be available closer. And then when the economics become a little bit less costly, change the copper out to fiber and eventually get to that direction. That's one way of doing it, sort of make one step forward and then eventually get closer and closer over time. And the cable companies tend to do a lot of that. They'll use fiber to get to a community, and then they'll deliver coax cable to people's homes and businesses. But that would be, I think those are probably the two places to go. And then, you know, the coverage problem, where we need to go, where we don't need to go, those are going to be, I guess, probably the roadmap to show us where we have to go in order to get that new technology in place. And it can be find the worst places and start there and work your way to the best. It could be do as many of the cable companies do, which is go to a community, then go to the next door community, then go to the next door community, then go to the next door community, because you've already built the infrastructure that you need on the way. You just keep adding to it, which in that case, means we're starting in the south and we're probably working our way north, but that isn't necessarily the best way either. How that goes, I guess, really depends on where do we have motivated people who are ready to go do things and get stuff done. That's where the partnerships come into play. And I would say that if there was a community that was ready to go and there are providers who are ready to go, they're going to find each other and they're going to get things done. And that's going to be the start. And then there'll be the flood. And we're kind of already seeing that with the Chesterfield Consolidated Communications project and the phone calls, as I understand, Consolidated is receiving from other communities who are saying, we're ready, we're ready, we're ready. And Consolidated is saying, hang on, we're not done yet. Let's get the first project out the door, and then we'll do others afterwards.
So one more question, and then we're going to wrap. So from Susan Almy, how much more does it cost to build out with fiber versus normal broadband with copper?
Well, the difference between, if you're talking about moving into a new area that has never had any kind of connectivity in place, the costs are likely going to be pretty equivalent, because if you're building out to every single home and business, you've got to go to every single building, outside of every single building, make a connection, bring that back to some pole, which gets aggregated, and then all of that needs to then go via some sort of fiber middle mile connection to some central source. And so the difference between fiber cable and copper cable these days, price-wise, is pretty close. Fiber is maybe just a bit more expensive, but the cost is not necessarily in the actual material that goes up on the poles. The cost is all in the labor, the people to go and make the connections up on the poles, to do the splicing, to make the drops and put them all in place. And that's where the labor expenses are. And so once that labor is put in place and that is all done, then that delivery is made available. And so the difference between a copper build out and a fiber build out in a totally new location where nothing exists are going to be pretty equivalent. Now, places that already have a telephone line where there's already a twisted pair copper line at the house, those are likely going to be less expensive if they're using that copper, because the copper is already there. And that becomes a question of, is that copper available, and does it qualify to have a broadband connection on it? DSL in the traditional sense, once you get past 3 miles from the central office, from the central aggregation point where the hardware is located, it degrades to the point where it's no longer really useful. So if you live more than 3 miles away from a central office in your community, you're probably not going to be able to get DSL. Or if you live between a repeater, a signal repeater, which is perfect. They were put in for telephones so that you could make a phone call, because that's what that repeater sits in. But digital signals don't go through repeaters. And that was the problem I had when I lived in Rochester. Was my wife would always say, "You're a DSL researcher. How come we can't get DSL at our house?" And I said, "Let me show you, hon." And we drove down the street and I said, "See that box up on the pole? That's the repeater. And we live on the other side of that repeater. If we lived on this side, we'd be able to get DSL. But because that repeater is there, signals don't go, and we can't go for DSL." So,
Scott, I feel like I should call you Dr. Valcourt.
No, I'm Scott. I'm always Scott. Everybody's called me Scott.
But
if
your
you call me
title that I've noticed that
yeah.
that Chris put for you is there. So first of all, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's a complicated conversation, but it's an essential, and it's never been more timely. Again, we've been at this. You've described some of the history of it. So we've been at this for a number of years, but now more than ever, to not just survive, but to thrive, we're going to need to complete this expansion. And I think after tonight, many folks might have a better idea of what it's going to take, and some of the partnerships that are in place or can be put into place some of the funding or access, like, when we're talking about, the community banking part of it, was something that, until you brought this up to me a few weeks ago, was very new. And I think it's important for people to know about as well. This is, I believe, it's an important infrastructure asset, and you put it so well succinctly. It's colleagues of yours have called it what I believe it's a basic human right. This is about equality across the state for our students, for our families, for access to healthcare. The picture, pardon the pun, has really changed for us. So this has been great. Thank you. So as we move along, so far we've completed 3 of the town halls. We have 2 more coming up. And I want to point out that when these town halls that we've been hosting have really been about issues that are important to folks in not just our district, but throughout New Hampshire, that they want to talk about. So we're honored and privileged to have you here to talk about an important New Hampshire issue. The next 2 we're going to be having on the 13th, so it'll be another Thursday night Zoom. We're going to talk about the municipal impacts of COVID. We're going to have a municipal leader, a community leader, and a business leader that are going to talk about some of the short term, some of the adaptations, and what we're going to need to think about moving forward. Then we have a week off because I have a Q&A that I'm going to be participating in as part of the campaign. And then on the 27th will be our final town hall, and Dan Weeks is going to be joining us from Revision Energy. He's going to talk about the partnership with the city of Lebanon. They've also done this in Hanover around solar arrays, generating some of our own energy, but really the conversation is about renewables, and ways to get that done in partnerships, and about clean energy. This is another, we were working on this beforehand, but this is another like silver lining, kind of like stop-start measure that's come to us because of COVID. So thanks for joining us to talk about an issue that's important to everybody in New Hampshire. I'm sure I'll see you out there, and thank you, again, thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a great night.
Yes. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night, Scott.
All right.
Doctor.
Bye-bye.
All right. End meeting for all. Here goes the broadband.